Hi, friends. I know there is a lot of bad news out there. And I know you come here for the food and the laughs and maybe to learn a little bit. So I want to reassure you that today's episode, though we of course talk about the very heavy reality of war, contains a lot of hope, some humor, and of course, really delicious cuisine. My guest today is Felicity Spector, a longtime broadcast journalist in London who since 2022 has volunteered in Ukraine, helping food organizations and reporting on the incredible resilience of Ukrainian home cooks, chefs, and bakers and food entrepreneurs, all of whom are keeping people fed on the front lines of the war. A big part of her work is supporting mobile bakeries. And when she was explaining the difficulties of keeping them running, I couldn't help but think of all the food truck owners that I've talked to over the years. No, they are not operating in a war zone, but I imagine them sitting down with these cooks in Odessa, sharing a couple of beers, and having so much common ground. Felicity and I share the perspective that small businesses, especially around food, are the glue of so much in society. With the frantic pace of the news cycle and all that pulls our focus, it is understandable that years into this war, there's less coverage of the reality on the ground in Ukraine that we're seeing every day. So in today's conversation, we are reminded that life goes on there and that the spirit of the Ukrainian people is being tested beyond imagination, but also that there are simple ways we can help and also be deeply inspired in the process. Today's conversation highlights the best thing about food, its ability to build and sustain community, even in the darkest days. Let's talk to Felicity.
This could happen to you. This could happen to you. This could happen to you.
Felicity Spector, welcome to Not From Concentrate.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm so grateful to have you here. I have to be honest with you, Felicity, I didn't sleep much last night because I just kept thinking about the conversation that we were going to have and the work that you're doing and, you know, how important it is and the seriousness of it compared to so many of the wonderful conversations that I have. But, you know, I've spent some time with your beautiful book, Bread and War. I've looked on your Substack and read some of, you know, what you're up to. But I would love if you could just set up for the listeners a little bit about what you're doing in Ukraine, how you came to be telling these stories, and just let us know the kind of work you've been doing since 2022.
Thank you so much. So yes, I first started going to Ukraine in the summer of 2022. I was originally helping a friend of mine, Olia Hercules, who you may know. She's a very prolific food writer, an incredible advocate for Ukraine. And she was immediately rushed into setting up a fundraising initiative, which has raised a huge amount of money called Cook for Ukraine. And as part of that, we held a bake sale that raised about £10,000. And while we were organising that, we tried to use the hashtag Bake for Ukraine. We thought, oh, someone else is using it. Who are these guys? And then that was then that I discovered these amazing very small non-profit. It's not even, you know, you can't even call it a charity really, although it's done incredible work. And they were all based in Odessa. And the first time I went to Ukraine, I took a convoy of baking equipment and flour and all sorts of supplies to a bakery in Kyiv, which their warehouse had been bombed because I'd already been in touch with them. And I figured I could organise something. I'd never done anything like that before, but it turned out that there were lots of people who was like super helpful, especially in the food industry, who I knew through my Instagram. And they immediately sort of rallied round when I said, do you have any professional baking equipment that you've got spare? And within about 48 hours, I had everything on the list, which the bakery needed. And then I found these incredible volunteers who agreed to drive it there. And then I met the Bake for Ukraine team in Odessa the second time I went in September 2022. And Odessa then was, it looks different each time. But at that point, there were lots of anti-tank traps in the city centre. There were loads of sandbags, huge military sort of installations right in the city centre to protect the city against what people then feared would be an assault by Russia to take the city by sea. Very fortunately, Ukraine managed to sink most of the Black Sea fleet using drones, and Russia has never got a chance of invading anywhere by sea anymore. So gradually those fortifications were taken down, and now Odessa is much completely opened up, even though there are a lot of attacks on the city all the time. Even just last night, and every night this week, I think. But I've been going there really regularly since that very first visit and supporting whatever I can do to help the Bake for Ukraine team there, fundraising, visiting all the projects, helping them to get the mobile bakeries that we have off the ground, and then writing about it in this book as well as part of the story of how people in food have helped Ukraine.
I want to back up for a second because you've been in broadcast journalism for over 30 years. In London, you're a home baker, but I think a lot of folks are probably wondering, who is this Felicity Spector and how did she find herself driving convoys through netted tunnels, avoiding drones, setting up this operation? So there's so much that I want to unpack here, but let's actually start going back a little bit and your professional and kind of personal background and what led you to become so involved.
I should just say that I can't drive, so I have zero practical skills apart from writing about them. But yeah, no. So I've worked in this very newsroom for over 37 years now, and this is all entirely separate from my professional life. Although I did start here as a trainee, but then very quickly went to the Moscow bureau because I'd studied a lot of Russian politics. I didn't do languages. I did politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford, but I sort of specialised in Soviet politics and history. And I always wanted to work in Moscow. Unfortunately, when I got to Moscow, I absolutely hated the place. It was a very depressing place to work. Very interesting news-wise, very interesting. It was the end of the USSR. There were loads of huge seismic changes in the Soviet communist rule over all of the Eastern Bloc countries. So it was very interesting, but actually living there was super depressing. But I always felt very close. My grandparents, who I never met, had come originally from Ukraine more than 100 years ago now and ended up in London. But I know nothing about them whatsoever. Sort of know their names and the fact that they came from, I think, Dnipro, what's called Dnipro now, which was Yekaterinoslav. And there was a big Jewish waves of emigration from Ukraine because of pogroms and so on around 1905. So I imagine that's when they came. But I'd always been absolutely fascinated to find out more and felt a real sort of pull to go and visit Ukraine. I feel sad that I didn't go before the full-scale war, apart from a very brief visit, I think, in 1991.
Incredible. And so just as you've done so much, but kind of summarize what you're working on now. I know there are these mobile bakeries that you've been a big part of. Could you explain a little bit how those came to be and how they operate?
So the girls, mostly girls now, are in Odessa. We have a very small team, but they're amazingly dedicated and they're all volunteers. So even though they live in very challenging circumstances, and one of them suffered, her house was badly damaged in one of the attacks very recently, but they've done incredible work. First of all, to find these mobile bakeries. They were from the Swiss Army about 50 or 60 years ago. Every Swiss Army battalion had a bakery because obviously they wanted to make croissants for their commanding officers or whatever. And they had all these vehicles which were fully equipped with ovens, generators, mixers, everything you need, and very self-contained, because obviously in a war situation, you may not have, well, you probably won't have access to the grid, or you have to hide it under trees or whatever. So they created these amazing vehicles and then decommissioned them about 20, 30 years ago, because even the Swiss realized they didn't really need to have dedicated bakers for each battalion. And some of them, for some reason, were apparently donated to Ukraine in the early 2000s. And our co-founder, Maria Kalenska, had come across one of these vehicles in Germany. She was living in Berlin at the beginning of the war, and an amazing guy called Florian had donated his bakery to them, his mobile bakery, so they could make bread to sell to raise money. And she began thinking how useful it would be in the food insecurity situation in Ukraine. So they began this kind of detective scheme, just of trying to track down where there might be mobile bakeries that were still intact, because a lot of them were chopped up. People kept the ovens and chucked out the rest because they didn't really need it to be able to travel around. But there were a few, and they managed, by daily looking in all the sort of second-hand adverts and all sorts of things, they found one that was actually not that far from Odessa. And then Ira helped to raise the money. And thanks to, unbeknownst to me, Jay Rayner had retweeted the link to my fundraiser in his column in The Observer. And I didn't realise, but suddenly all the money started coming in. We had the whole lot, $17,000 or so raised in 3 days. So I was very grateful to Jay. He wouldn't accept any gift or anything. He said, "Oh, no, I don't need anything, but, it's just a good scheme." So we went then to this place called Ismail and bought the first mobile bakery. And it needed a bit of doing up. And we had it in Odessa just to make bread, which people then delivered to displaced people, refugees, and so on in that region. And the commitment of Bake for Ukraine was to make traditional Ukrainian sourdough bread. So they wanted to make good quality bread with the old techniques. There's a very iconic bread called palyanitsa, which is like the standard Ukrainian sourdough. It's very nutritious and it keeps very well. And they also wanted to make a seeded rye, which keeps really well. And also for people, a lot of the elderly people have diabetes or some condition, and this bread is much better for them. And people like it because it reminds them of their childhood and so on. And we buy flour from an excellent Ukrainian wheat farmer in Odessa region, so it helps his business as well. So it's a very sort of positive circular economy. Then they managed to track down 2 more mobile bakeries. One of them is in pretty bad condition, but the other one wasn't too bad. And we raised money again, thanks to some amazing American bakeries last year, to repair that. So at the moment, there's one in Mykolaiv, one in Odessa, and the Mykolaiv one is a bit clapped out now because it's been used so much. So we're going to swap them around and then repair. It's a never-ending cycle. The biggest problem is because there hasn't been much electricity at all. Odessa was cut off completely for days on end, and it's really hard to make ovens work. These mobile bakeries have really come into their own. It's quite expensive in terms of generator fuel, but they can operate whether or not there's a national grid.
Felicity, one of the really incredible things about your writing is how you capture how life goes on in a war zone. Business has to happen, money needs to be made, people need to eat. And you do such a beautiful job of capturing that human spirit and the resilience. And you speak of people baking the bread and ducking when they hear drone attacks and then kind of dusting themselves off and going back to it. And I'm curious how it's affected your sense of the world, of the importance of food. You've been obviously a reporter for a long time, but this experience in particular, how has it shifted your thinking about humans and the things that we endure or can endure?
I mean, thank you for that. It's really kind of you. I think it's brought me a new appreciation of small businesses, actually. I've become really interested in how they are really the heart of communities because they provide jobs, they pay taxes back into the economy, and they provide really essential services. And we kind of take them for granted. You go to a shop and you buy something, but someone's got to run that shop and someone's got to deliver the goods to that shop and someone's got to provide the back office, till receipts, financial advice and all sorts of things. So there's a huge mechanism behind that casual encounter with somebody in a shop. In these frontline territories, they're even more crucial. A lot of them don't have shops. I mean, a lot of the villages where we go with our bread, for example, there's nothing there. And the houses are really badly damaged. Sometimes there's no running water, there's no electricity. So people run off generators and they have bottled water delivered by charities usually, or sometimes a state-run organisation. So in those situations, the fact that there's somebody there, either a business or a charity, who, despite living through war themselves, is still prepared to help other people who are even worse off, is really amazing, really. It's very inspiring. And I'm very impressed by the way that Ukrainians have this spirit of generosity, but also are very practical, and they work out ways to make logistics happen. And in these situations, again, logistics is a huge issue in war zones. I mean, like with these drone tunnels, for example, the threat of these drones was making life, well, it still is, making life incredibly miserable for people in these frontline cities, which are very close to the Russian positions. They send in these small drones with grenades or small explosives, which they then can drop onto buses or regular people in cars, people just walking around, going to the shops, or emergency workers trying to put out fires. So you can imagine how impossible it is to even venture out to buy food if it might cost your life. So inventing these drone tunnels made of ordinary fishing nets, it's not 100% effective, but it is something which has helped people in parts of these cities. They can't cover the whole place, but it's helped people to get back to some kind of way of life. even though it's very curtailed. But these kind of innovations, they thought them up. They obviously, somebody who knew what was needed managed to make it happen. And that's what I'm continually impressed with. With our mobile bakery, the thing is always breaking down. It's super old. We've patched it together with various sort of, I don't know, bits of spare parts and so on. And they don't get defeated by it. I mean, my instinct would just be, oh my God, there were, massive metal shard breaks, and they just find somebody in the middle of nowhere with a soldering kit who can sort of put it together again at a moment's notice, rather than just say, oh my goodness, we have to stop. There's this, we can't possibly continue. And the same, with organizations like the Ukrainian Railways, which is having huge problems now because Russians are attacking trains, moving trains with passengers on. So now they've had to put through all these protocols to take passengers off trains in the middle of the night if there's a drone, hide in the bushes near the track. I mean, you can't even imagine how stressful that is. But they want to get people to their destination in one piece, and they obviously don't want to put them at any extra risk. So they're trying to think of ways, rerouting trains, coming up with different alternatives, but they are still running. And it's astonishing, really, how quickly they try to adapt to all these new challenges.
So, Felicity, I think most people listening to this podcast are food lovers, and this idea that, having a touch point like a traditional food and good quality food is so important in trying times, let alone, in a war zone. But a statistic that I had never heard until the war started, and it just blew me away, was that something like 50% of the world's wheat comes from Ukraine. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about just how important bread is in Ukrainian food culture.
I mean, bread is, and all grains, in fact, they have a huge love for buckwheat, but bread is really, really important. The very fertile soil, Chernozem, the black soil of Ukraine, is what's behind all this amazing produce that they have. I mean, all of it, fruit, vegetables, dairy, everything is really high quality. And you can see these huge fields of wheat, sunflower, soy, and they're very proud of this, the quality of it and the fact that they supply a lot of the world. Ukrainian traditions, every festival, every holiday, there's usually a special bread associated with it. So Easter's coming up, and they make Pascha, which is a bit like a sort of panettone in that same shape. At Christmas, you often have a bread called zavivanets, which is like a sort of babka with poppy seed filling. A korovai is a hugely beautiful braided bread with decorations that people have at a wedding. So there's a lot of these special breads, and there's been a lot written about how totemic it is. And especially this palyanitsa that I talked about, the iconic Ukrainian sourdough loaf. The very word palyanitsa has become a very symbolic one. Apparently Russians can't pronounce it. It's hard for them to get their tongue round. People think Russian and Ukrainian is the same. It's not. It's really, really not the same language at all. It's got similar alphabet, but it's not. The words are the vocabulary is very different. And at the very beginning of the war, when Russian soldiers were moving in on big cities like Kharkiv and Kiev, there were lots of roadblocks, and Ukrainians, it said, used to stop people they didn't know and ask them to say the word palyanitsa. And if they couldn't say it, they were like, "Whoa, we're a bit suspicious of you. Go and get checked out." So this is something which, is so powerful for Ukrainians, and it's their sort of national bread, if you like. And all of these, I've been to visit a lot of these old bakeries where people have gone back now to these old techniques of making bread in wood-fired ovens out in the yard, and they share them among the village and so on. And we've bought an oven for a lady in Kharkiv, and then a lady in Kherson who lost their house, but they used to bake bread for people in their local community. And so we just bought them a domestic oven. But, it's just another example of things that we can do to help individuals feed their communities at all sorts of different levels.
Yeah, there was a passage in the book. It's actually not baking, but I was hoping you could speak to it a little bit more, because it really goes back to that feeding the communities. And it says they put their many years of cooking experience into the recipes, coming up with ways to produce dehydrated versions of restaurant quality dishes like tom yum soup, pasta carbonara, and spiced porridge, using the best quality ingredients they could find. Many of the fruits and vegetables came from Valerie's family farm, where they built their own smoker in the yard behind their catering firm to recreate an authentic barbecue taste for the meat. In a converted storeroom, they installed a couple of dehydrators alongside neatly stacked packs of dried onions, sour cream, mushrooms, and several kinds of cheese. They began producing hundreds of thousands of packs of their dried food, tucked into smart blue and silver packaging to match their logo. They somehow fitted in the work after business hours, constantly fundraising to pay for it all, along with posting regular video reports to show what they were getting up to. Could you speak a little bit about what's going on there?
So that was this group. It's a small catering company on the left bank of Kiev. And the guys who run it, a chef who calls himself Maestro, and two others, Alexei, who is the manager, they set up very quickly after the full-scale war started this operation to try and make this dried food, because they realized that soldiers at the front, once the imminent threat to Kiev was over, when a lot of restaurants were feeding soldiers sort of directly inside the city, when they moved towards the eastern front lines, they were in conditions where they couldn't cook anything. So these chefs decided to make this dried food, and they really, they put as much work into it as they would have done if they were catering a banquet or a party, because they wanted, they call them our boys, and they said, they deserve to have the best possible food. And I went to meet them. I'd been following them on Instagram. I don't know how I even first came across them. I guess it suggested it to me. And I didn't know them at first. They looked like they were very kind and decent people. So I approached them and said, can I come and visit your Kyiv operation? And they welcomed me there with a translator. And we had a really amazing meeting with them. And their food was fantastic. They made up these dishes of the dried food for us so we could try it. And it was such good quality. You couldn't imagine that it just came out of a packet. They save up money, and each couple of months, when they have enough, they travel out to the east of Ukraine and they go to visit one of the battalions that they support, and they take a sort of traveling cafe with them. So they put all the ingredients, the cooking equipment, everything that they need in the back of a van and drive all the way out east, and then set up a sort of mobile cafe, because they said the lads can't go to a cafe anymore, but we want to bring it to them. And they usually have, they ask them, what would you like us to cook for you? And then they make really elaborate dishes. So I went with them on it was a sort of 3-day trip. And we visited a military hospital where the food was somewhat lacking. And they knew the nurse there really well. So she said, please come, the guys need your food. And then they went to a base, or sort of a village, where guys from the 3rd Assault Brigade were living, and that was near the Kupiansk direction, which in a place which now I think is impossible to reach. Unfortunately, that's one of the areas where the Russians have advanced quite a lot. So I think the area where we went just last year is probably not possible to get to that direction now. And then we had to cook all these dishes. Some of them they served to the soldiers who were there in the base. And then, as I say base, it was a house really. They had camouflage netting above where we were cooking, which it was quite a surreal sort of situation. And they were making quesadillas and burgers with smoked cheese and bacon jam and caramelized onions and things. They really made a decent effort to make something, as good as possible. And then some of it they took into the Donetsk region. It was really late at night, and we went down to a city called Druzhkivka, which is now under evacuation. Sadly, again, the Russians have advanced in those areas. But at that time, there were still units who could come into the town, pick up the food, and then sort of go back to their positions with it. And we stopped there's a border checkpoint on the way into the Donetsk region. And they stopped there and they said, let's ask them if they want some burgers. And I'm sure those guys, no one really speaks to them. They just sort of go through the checkpoint and, maybe say hello, and then on they go. And Alexei jumped down and went over, do you want some burgers? And they were like, what? What, here? They were all just grinning. And you think, it's just a small thing, giving someone a homemade, very well crafted, but, a homemade burger. And it really brings, boosts their morale so much. And it just shows how, I guess, they know that they're not forgotten about, and the guys know that they've done something, to improve a really difficult life. Because all of those guys will be volunteers to the army or mobilized. They just had ordinary jobs before the war, and they're not professional soldiers. So it's like helping their neighbors and friends.
So, Felicity, you've spent so much time there volunteering, and you do this beautiful thing with your reporting where you're sharing the difficult situation there, the horrible situations these folks are in, but then you're also keeping us engaged with these moments of humanity, these moments of resilience. And I think when there is so much negative news in the world and the news cycles move so quickly, that's such a smart thing to do because it makes you want to come back when you feel like there's hope, when it feels like there's something you can do. But I imagine that's a difficult way for you to live and to have to both share the difficult pieces and then excavate these beautiful moments and share them. And I'm curious how you're doing it and how it's affecting you just personally, because that is a lot for one person to hold.
I do feel that sometimes. I get frustrated when I feel that it's not being covered as much as I would like it to be, and people sort of have moved on, or there isn't time. And I'm like, but this is really important. And I understand that there are loads of other things competing for attention, and that's just how it is. So I can just do what I can in my own way. I would love to be able to write more. Each time I go, I could write so many pieces for magazines and stuff. I have ideas about people I want to visit and, farmers and they're the front line who is continuing to farm. There are bakeries which are still open, supplying bread to people really close to the border. There are businesses. I've just been to Kherson and I'm doing a story there about small businesses. But all of these people, it is something hopeful, and it is something where, anger is a very negative and draining emotion. And obviously you feel angry when you see, a horrible attack like yesterday in Lviv when a beautiful 17th century monastery was on fire, and shocking and horrible. And, I know people who live across from them at the hotel I stay in is around the corner. So, all of those things would just make you feel very powerless. But I think when you see what people are doing to try and improve their own lives and the lives of other people and still thinking, what can we do to help? It's something positive. I mean, obviously, it's a struggle to raise money and awareness and so on. But I do find here in the UK that people are really open to, they're very supportive generally, and that, they're willing to help if you ask them for something specific. Can we hold a pop-up or something? It's just trying to get those things organised, which is also quite hard because I only have so many hours in the day. And there are a lot of, sometimes like yesterday, one of our volunteers went to one of the villages with the delivery of bread. And it was really, she said the tone was very different. People were really desperate suddenly. There's been many, many weeks of a blackout and no electricity and no heating and so on through the winter. And she said this time there was a woman in tears because there wasn't enough bread, and people were sort of pushing to try and get to it and so on. And she said, oh God, this is really urgent. We really, really need to increase our funding so we can just make more because people really, really need it. So, and now I'm thinking, what can I do to try and make that happen? So yeah, that sometimes feels, I don't want to have this.
You're one person.
Yeah, I'm only one person, and there's a huge team, and there's other people who live much more directly with it. So I don't want to imagine that, I'm the only person that can help, because I know the people get that sort of syndrome where they mean well, but suddenly it becomes like, oh, I can't take a day off because no one will be there to help people. But, you have to pace yourself. And I've had a really supportive. In Ukraine, I have an amazing group of friends there who have been so helpful and welcoming. They help me translate. My Ukrainian is terrible, and they help me with all the logistics because sometimes it's quite complicated to get around, finding bus stations and individual buses and so on. It's not easy, any of it, if you don't know what you're doing. So I'm really grateful to all of that. And I'm just always amazed that people find the energy to be helpful when, their own lives are so difficult. And you do feel sometimes, I feel a bit guilty that I just jet off home and like, oh, bye-bye. I'm going back to my nice warm house with, I can just pop out to the shops whenever I want. And I keep across sometimes the air alert app because it's on my phone, and I'm checking in on people because if there's a big attack somewhere, I just, obviously I want to message to make sure they're okay and that nothing happened to them and so on. And because often it gets very close. So that also you feel quite emotionally, you don't want to escape from it, but also it's kind of a lot to kind of still hold on to. Cheesecake helps, I think. I do eat quite well there.
Whether you're in a war zone or you're in London, the cheesecake helps. I did want to spend some time talking about this incredible book that you wrote and what your hope is for this book and what went into it and how it came to be.
I haven't written, it's the first time I've written a book, although I've been a writer for nearly 40 years. I guess it was actually on one of the trips quite early on in December 22. And I was with volunteers in Donetsk region, and it was a really long, it was almost like a 24-hour day. They'd driven all the way from Kyiv, had a tiny amount of sleep somewhere in the forest in Liman in the north of Donetsk region, and then driven all the way down, dropping off supplies with these units that they were supporting along the way. There wasn't time to stop at all. There was nowhere even to go to the loo for sort of 12, 14 hours. We finally got to this place, this volunteer kitchen, opened the door, and there was this incredible table full of amazing food, all cooked by just local women, all day, every day. For volunteers, soldiers, locals, anybody who, no questions asked, come in and get it, it's all free. And I was so amazed by this. I just thought, and people need to know these stories because it's part of the story of how the country has kept going. It doesn't happen automatically. It happens because people like Natalia and her other volunteers make things run on time and make people comfortable and help to take the pressure off and know the kind of less than perfect official food supply to the army and so on. So all of those people, their stories would, I felt really deserved to be heard. And then once we'd started the Bake for Ukraine mobile bakery operation, I thought, well, that's also like a really interesting story. And maybe other people in different situations could take some inspiration from it, in places where they also need to supply communities in difficult situations. Maybe that's an idea that they could take and run with, and maybe they could learn a bit from Ukrainian experience. So I thought, well, I'll tell the story of like how society is dealing with the war through people in food, because those are the people I know. And you can see all sorts of things through that. You can talk about volunteers, you can talk about the army, you can talk about businesses, you can talk about individual cities that are in really especially difficult situations like Kherson, which has been under siege for 3.5 years, Kharkiv, which is also very close to the front line. And you can see how people in those cities are so committed to staying there that they want to make it work. And then, of course, you've got the cultural side, which are the chefs and the really cool young people who are modernizing Ukrainian food and trying to make people all over the world excited about trying it. Olia Hercules, obviously here, had done a lot in that regard with her books. Her first one came out 10 years ago. So people here have sort of heard of her, and she's often on television, but, there aren't very many Ukrainian restaurants, and people often don't know what Ukrainian food is like. So I thought, well, this will also help to bring it to people who want to try it. And, maybe they'll then get excited to go to find their local Ukrainian cafe and have some syrniki. I want everyone to enjoy syrniki. It's such an amazing dish.
Can you share a little bit about some other iconic Ukrainian dishes? And for folks who don't know that much about the cuisine and maybe just think of borscht and seeded rye.
Borscht is, UNESCO recognized it now as an item of Ukrainian culinary heritage, thanks to Yevhen Klopotenko.
As well they should.
Well, yes. It is a national dish, but it's very different wherever you go in Ukraine. So if you have it in the west of Ukraine, there's a lot of beetroot. It's beetroot forward. It's sort of sweeter. There's often smoked dried pears to kind of give it this amazing umami sort of flavor. If you go to the south of Ukraine, it could be made with fish, because it's on the coast. From Kherson region, for example, my friend there makes it with catfish. And then she puts a lot of very sour ingredients like fermented tomatoes and fermented cabbage and not that much beetroot. So it tastes very different, but it's still borscht. You can get green borscht, which is a summery one with sorrel. So there's a lot of versions of it, but it's kind of at its base, it's basically a sort of vegetable soup with beetroot and a kind of usually a meat stock, but it could be vegan or vegetarian nowadays because people look for that too. And it's served with these delicious garlic bread rolls called pampushki, which are kind of white bread rolls brushed with sunflower oil with a ton of garlic and herbs. So a very good accompaniment. But often they have it with salo, which is like a pork fat thing. And on the plate, if you get sort of in a cafe, they'll often put a raw green onion, raw garlic to rub on the rye bread, and then a big chunk of this pork fat. And that just comes in a sort of little side plate with your borscht. Or if you're like me and you don't eat pork, they're like, you don't eat pork? Oh, okay. Wow, okay. More garlic for you then. But yes, it's almost like a ceremonial thing to sort of prepare it by rubbing the garlic on and sort of chomping through the raw onion halfway through the soup. So yeah, very delicious. There's another dish called banosh, which is a bit like polenta, I suppose. It's made in a similar way with cornmeal, but they make it with cream and milk rather than with sour cream and milk rather than with water, just water. And then on top of that, again, the meat eaters, they do like their pork. They would sort of have this fried, crackling type stuff, pork fat. And if not, then you would have fried mushrooms and onions and some white cheese called brinza, which is a bit like a feta. And all of the markets in Ukraine, you have these amazing halls full of dairy produce. And it's just incredible, the range. A lot of what they call cottage cheese, but it's drier than the cottage cheese that you might think of. And that's used to make these syrniki. And it can be slightly sour or not. And then you can have it made with baked milk. So it's sort of caramelized. And then all these different kinds of brinza. Some of them are really powerful. You have to try them first before you buy it. And some of them have been sort of matured for a long time. And you put a tiny piece and you're like, oh my God, okay, I'm not getting that one. But yeah, they're incredibly delicious. Cow's milk, goat's milk, sheep milk. I mean, they use whatever they have locally. And they're, very high quality. And then obviously vareniki, which are like the dumplings, they're usually stuffed with potato, onion or cabbage, and served with sour cream. Sour cream comes by default on the side of everything, so never without that. And then there are loads of delicious poppy seed-filled crepes and the pancakes made with apples, like a sort of apple fritter. And of course, many kinds of my favourite syrniki, which you can have savoury or sweet, sometimes with raisins in. When people who grew up with them as children and their mum would make a huge plate of them in the morning and they would sort of take some to school and so on. So there's a lot of those dishes, very humble ingredients, but like really good quality and, simply made, but always very delicious.
Well, while we're on the subject of food, in every episode, I do something called the Busy Brain section of the podcast. And I ask 2 questions that seem, considering your lifestyle, even more relevant. So the first is, what do you do to get inspired in the kitchen and spark creativity when you are not feeling particularly joyful or inspired?
I mean, I do like watching videos online, especially friends of mine who have made, I don't really cook much. I bake, so I make cakes. At the moment, I haven't been able to use my apartment as a nightmare. I haven't lived there for 6 months because of various building works. But when I can borrow a kitchen from someone at the moment, I usually just something that's in season, like rhubarb or pears or something that I really want to make something with that. And then I really enjoy sort of like looking through what people have posted, and then something catches my eye and I'm like, right, I'm definitely making that. And then I go out and buy everything and try and recreate it. But I think the seasonal vegetables and fruit is what really I find most inspiring. I really enjoy sort of just trying to make the best out of those.
And then the second question is, how do you calm the chaos? And that can be physical chaos or mental chaos. But how do you calm the chaos in the kitchen?
In the kitchen? Oh, God, try and shut the door on it. No. I mean, I don't really listen to a sort of nice podcast or something while I'm cooking. Maybe yours. Or sometimes there's a British show called The Archers, which is a long-running drama about families in an agricultural setting. Sounds terrible. It's been going for 75 years. I feel I've been listening to it for the whole 75 years. But my late mum used to listen to it, so I started when I was in college. And that's just like, it's so British. So if everything is kind of seems mad. I mean, I've listened to that podcast on sort of dodgy bus journeys through bits of Ukraine. I probably regret going to. And it just like, oh, you know what, this is fine. Or a comedy or something like that. Because I always think having laughing about something silly is always a good way to sort of calm any sort of chaos that's going on. Or sometimes it adds to it, but in a good way.
Absolutely. So the last thing is, of course, people want to know how they can help. Besides buying bread in war, how can folks get involved and help? Thanks.
It's really, I'm in the process of putting up another Just Giving page, and I will have a link to that. It's just going through. The previous one was related to our winter campaign, so I've just started another one for getting us through the spring. So there'll be that, and that's quite an easy way to donate. Bake for Ukraine also has a donation page, but you have to go through, I think, PayPal or one of those. So sometimes people don't like making that or can't make that work, but that does exist, and they can give donations you have to quote Bake for Ukraine. You can also give donations through a platform based in Germany called WeAid, which handles all of the finances. My friend Maria Kolenska has also written a beautiful, beautiful book, which has just come out, called Cuisines of Odessa, and profits from that will also go to Bake for Ukraine. I really urge you to buy it as well. It's an amazing book. She spent 10 years kind of with the concept and then actually wrote and produced and photographed it during the full-scale war, which was not an easy achievement, especially in a city under such a lot of attacks.
Okay. Well, we will put links to all of this in the newsletter that goes out with the podcast and also the show notes. Where can we find you and follow along on all the important work that you're doing?
I have very basic names on all my social media is just at Felicity Spector, and on Instagram I have that, and then on Substack it's called Flower Power, my Substack. So, but I think you could probably find it under my name. I would do it more frequently, but I write all day at work.
A couple things going on.
Yeah, I would love to do even more, but sometimes I try to get newspaper and magazine commissions when I'm in Ukraine just to tell stories a bit more widely, but also, just to try and remind people that things are still happening and that people are still trying to have a positive influence on their community. So I really, really appreciate any opportunity just to reach out to people and tell those stories, because it's not about me in any way. It's about the people I meet and the amazing resilience which they have, which isn't a special Ukrainian trait that they somehow have from birth. It's just something they've had to learn and adapt to. And they are very strong people. They don't suffer fools gladly. They crack on, as it were, but everybody's human. And I know it means a lot to them and to my friends to know that people abroad are still remembering that, and supporting them. They do really, really appreciate it.
Felicity Spector, thank you for taking the time to share your stories and recipes and experiences in Ukraine. I am wishing you and all the people of Ukraine strength and safety and good food and, of course, an end to the war.
Thanks so much.
And you, thank you for spending time today. I'd encourage you to check out the show notes, follow Felicity on Instagram or Substack, and of course, buy her book or donate to one of the organizations that she champions if you are able. I also hope you'll share this episode with a friend so we can share Felicity's reporting more widely and support these important organizations and small businesses. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time. Not From Concentrate is produced by me with audio and video editing by Kevin O'Connell. Our assistant producer is Allie Miller, and the theme music is by Kylie Daly.